Henry George was a newspaper man who molds himself into being a social philosopher, because as a newspaper fellow, he's in the business of reporting what he sees, and he's not out there to make money so much as he's asking himself a deep, soulful question. What does it mean, what I'm seeing, all this poverty that's emerging in San Francisco, which has always had poverty, but it's always had a very fluid social class. That is, somebody could strike it rich with gold and become wealthy, and the next day somebody who's very wealthy might be poor. It wasn't until after the gold rush that the shape of civilization that we're familiar with began to emerge. That is, the businessmen on top and the bankers up here. But prior to that, it really was very much a dynamic situation. And George had lived here since 1858. He came to San Francisco from Philadelphia in 1858. And he saw the last bits of the gold rush dynamic society where things could change. And he saw this emerging strata, and he was wondering, why is this? We've got the Industrial Revolution is producing so many goods. You can buy stuff that's made by machines rather than by hand. Really, I mean, it's hard for us as we stand here to really appreciate what the world looked like in 1840. In 1840, everything's made by hand. 1840 is really a big divide when factories begin producing most of the stuff that's consumed rather than it being made by hand. And George is looking at the world and saying, there's all this stuff being made. There's more than we can even buy. You could go into a grocery store today, everything's bought, and 2 days later the shelves are filled again. You could go into a hardware store, everything could be purchased, and 2 days later it's filled. How does this happen? It's amazing. This did not exist 200 years ago. It was all made by hand, and you couldn't reproduce it that quickly. How is it possible that there's both progress and poverty? George is wondering. He's looking at, why is it that with the industrialization of the West, and America in particular, why is it that despite plenty of everything, there's still the poor? Why does this persist? His goal was to answer the question of, specifically, why are wages so low? That, for instance, the Marriott workers are on strike. Why aren't they getting enough? In 1877, he begins writing and completes by 1879 a book, Progress and Poverty. He wanted to start out with, who owns what anyhow? So he asked the question, what gives a person the right to say that this is mine and not yours, this is yours and not mine, this is ours? For instance, this park. His explanation for ownership was making something makes it yours. So for instance, using this hat, if it doesn't exist, I make it, it's now mine because I made it. You didn't make it, you didn't make it. Or alternatively, if I pay the person who made this hat and all the people who are associated with that, and I want the hat, it becomes mine because I've traded what I have made for what you've made or what those people have made. It's reciprocity. And for George, reciprocity was sufficient. If there is reciprocity, there should be no poverty. That is, if people are exchanging goods and services for the value of goods and services, then there should be no injustice. Let's put it that way. And yet there's injustice. So George was like, what's the matter? How else to explain this? Labor's giving and being paid for its labor. Capital should not be dominating. What's the problem? He then engaged in what he called a mind experiment. He looked over at a building such as this one, let's say, and in his equation, his math, he said, if the person who paid to have that building put up did so and paid everyone who had a part in it, there's reciprocity. There should be no problem. But there is a problem. So in his mind, he removed that part of the equation. He removed the building and asked himself, what is left? And what is left? Land. If making something makes it yours, who made land? Well, nobody. So who gets to own land? Who gets to own land is whoever has a bigger fist, or who gets there first. George is saying, how can there be justice if people are being constantly forced away from land? So he applied his making something makes it yours logic to an aspect of land to answer this question. This piece of land underneath that building, not the building, but the piece of land underneath that building, here in San Francisco was worth a lot more than an equally sized piece of land out in the country. Why? More people are willing to give up their energy to be here. More people are willing, the Marriott workers, are willing to give up blood, sweat, and tears, energy, in order to be here rather than out in the countryside. So using the logic of making something makes it yours, to whom does the value of land belong? Society. The reason a piece of land has value isn't because a particular person owns it, it's because other people want it. That's why it has value. If only one person, the owner, wants it, it doesn't have any economic exchange value. So George argued that the value of land belongs to the community. He called for a single tax on the annual value of land. And so the value of that portion of that piece of real estate that's underneath the building would belong to society, its annual value. As a corollary, that is, as another part of his analysis, he said, did the building, since it was made by somebody, was that made by society? No. So its value belongs to the creator. So he called for no taxes on work, no taxes on business, no tax on people making or doing something. Only a tax on monopoly, on owning something that nobody made, but which has value because other people want it. His assertion is that what workers are doing and what hotel owners are doing is providing a good or a service. And a good or a service does not subtract from society. But when somebody says, this part of the earth is mine and you can't use it, that's a subtraction. And that's why that value has to be paid to society. In San Francisco, literally, this piece of land is probably worth at least $1,000 a year. Just this piece of land. In the world in the mind frame in which you live right now, you have been taught to believe, and you do believe, that if I own it and you want to stand here, you're going to pay me to be here. The way George looked at the world was, I have to pay you to stay off. You don't have to pay me to use this, I have to pay you to stay off, and that's my tax. And if I do that, the roads will be paid for out of this value, multiplied times all the land value of San Francisco. The homeless will be taken care of out of land value, not out of taxes on work, not out of taxes on business, but out of the value of land itself. And in that fashion, not just psychologically, but materially, social programs will be paid for out of the value of society, because the value of location is the value of society, the people, right? People are willing to pay to be here. That's the value of place. Same in Hamburg. You move that building out in the countryside in Germany to Hamburg and it's worth more. Is it because the building itself is worth more, or the location? It's the location. And this is George's argument. That location was not made by the owner, but it has value because of the presence of community. All the other buildings, the streets, the transportation system, the degree of education of the population and such. 80% of the value of real estate in San Francisco is in land. It's not in the buildings. But society doesn't collect that. Instead, it gives it to people like me. And it wonders, how are we going to pay for the homeless? It has to tax itself, because it's not taxing me for this piece of land that I own. It has to tax people who work. To see the cat is to see that there is a distinction to be made when speaking of human relationships, when speaking of something made by individuals or groups of individuals, and something made by the presence of community. For George, the proof that there is such a thing as community is that there is a price to land. There were very few photographs taken afterwards because it's illegal. You cannot even talk about this in China. When I have Chinese guests on this tour, some of them turn away, fearful that they're going to be seen by spies. I mean, I don't think there are spies, but that's how concerned they are that this is still that touchy an issue. It's not on the internet. You can do a research, you can do a Google search in China, and none of this will come up. It's blocked by the regime.